You believe surrender means defeat, the collapse of effort, and the loss of control. You equate strength with resistance, identity with the power to assert. To let go feels like disappearance. Yet Abdul Al Qadar al-Jilani questioned this logic. He said the one who truly surrenders does not lose agency, but returns it to its rightful source. The ego resists because it depends on the illusion of ownership. What you call strength is often the strain of maintaining a separate will. Abdul Al Qadar called surrender not subservience, but lucidity, the realization that nothing ever acted apart from the one. If the movement of life never belonged to you, what exactly is weakened when you stop pretending to command it? Abdul Al Qadar lived in 12th century Baghdad, a world of law, order, and intellectual precision. He was trained as a jurist, fluent in systems of reasoning and theology. Yet he saw that external control without inward humility leads to division. His path joined legal clarity with spiritual transparency. Law, he said, protects form. Surrender reveals truth. To follow divine command is not to imitate authority, but to recognize that no command originates outside it. For him, discipline was not repression of will, but remembrance that will itself is divine. The self does not govern life. It participates in its unfolding. You spend your days managing outcomes, correcting errors, defending expectations. You believe stability depends on vigilance. Yet beneath that vigilance lies fatigue. Every plan implies separation, a controller and what must be controlled. Abdul Al Qadar named this the first illusion. The mind imagines itself as a rival to divine order. It insists on improvement while fearing the loss of identity. But control creates the very chaos it tries to escape. The more you intervene, the more divided you become. Surrender is not indifference to events. It is release from the fantasy that events revolve around you. When every act is already included in divine movement, what remains for the ego to defend? For Abdul Al Qadar, surrender was not weakness, but clarity of perception. It is the moment when the mind stops confusing obedience with loss and control with power. To surrender is to see that your will and the divine will were never two. The ego imagines choice as proof of independence. Surrender exposes choice as revelation. You do not vanish by yielding. You become transparent to what acts through you. The command submit is not a demand but a disclosure. There was never more than one will to begin with. If surrender ends illusion, then who is left to claim strength or weakness? Abdul Al Qadar was uncompromising in practice. He demanded fasting, prayer, service, and restraint. Yet he said discipline means nothing unless it refines perception. Outer effort prepares the mind for inner release. The act itself is not the point. The awareness that performs it is. You kneel not to display submission, but to witness the one who already moves your body. Discipline is the training of sight, not the assertion of virtue. The purpose is to recognize who truly acts. When the act is performed without ownership, it fulfills its essence. Can you perform completely without claiming the performance? The ego fears surrender because it cannot survive without ownership. Even devotion becomes another possession. You say, "I have surrendered," and the claim revives the separation. Abdul Al Qadar warned that the ego's final disguise is spiritual pride, the believer who believes in their belief. True surrender cannot be claimed because the one who claims it has already disappeared. When you observe the mind naming itself as obedient or enlightened, you see the same impulse that once said, "I am strong." Both arise from division. What remains when even the wish to be pure no longer belongs to anyone? Can there be devotion when there is no self left to devote? At the center of Abdul Al Qadar's teaching lies a simple, disorienting insight. There is only one will. The tension between mine and thine exists only in imagination. Human will is the place where divine command becomes conscious. When you recognize this, resistance ends. You still act, but effort loses strain because it no longer competes with what is. You are not giving up your will. You are seeing through its imagined independence. The paradox dissolves. Obedience and freedom are not opposites, but one motion. The question shifts from what should I do to who is acting now? If every choice is already included in divine action, can anything truly oppose it? When this insight deepens, action becomes simple. You act as required, without calculation or anxiety. The thought I must control fades into it moves through me. This is not passivity, but precision. Abdul Al Qadar described it as trust in motion, the point where faith becomes the absence of interference. Life unfolds as a single order. You participate without distortion. Peace arises not from obtaining what you want, but from ceasing to interpret every event as personal. When the self is no longer the center of experience, clarity returns. If nothing must be managed, what remains except the quiet certainty that all is already aligned? The final stage of surrender is not effort, but disappearance. The claim to authorship dissolves. The mind that once said, "I surrender," realizes it never had power to resist. What remains is awareness without ownership, the same presence that animated every act all along. Even the desire for awakening is recognized as divine movement. The distinction between seeker and sought vanishes. Abdul Al Qadar said, "When you see no self between you and God, you have arrived." But nothing has traveled. The path was illusion. The destination was always here. If every impulse was his from the beginning, who remains to awaken? Surrender, in Abdul Al Qadar's view, does not occur in time. It reveals that time itself belongs to what never opposed the divine. The ego breaks not through defeat, but through recognition that it never existed apart from what it resisted. What you called surrender was always reality seeing itself clearly. You began thinking surrender meant loss. You end seeing it as truth. The self does not vanish. It is understood as a temporary name for what never divided. There is nothing left to defend, nothing to control, nothing to reconcile. The act has ceased, but it continues. When all effort dissolves into awareness, what remains is not silence, but understanding that there was never more than one will. The inquiry begins with the belief that surrender equals weakness. To Abdul Al Qadar's reasoning, that assumption collapses. You discover that the habit of control is the ego's method of survival. It must imagine separation to preserve itself. Discipline prepares perception. Surrender removes illusion. As the mind's claim to authorship dissolves, the idea of resistance loses meaning. The paradox resolves itself. To surrender is not to yield, but to see clearly. When only one will remain, the search for mastery ends. Awareness recognizes its own movement, unbound and continuous. The ego was not broken. It was understood as never real. Surrender is not an act within duality, but the revelation that duality was never there to begin with.